Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A very big welcome to all of you on behalf of New Zealand Christians in Science and ISCAST. This is our third conversation in our series on ethics, uncharted waters, Christian ethics in a rapidly changing world. I also welcome especially our speaker, Professor Jonathan Boston from New Zealand. He speaks in the area of public policy, which is, of course, examining the ethics of how we should organize and order our societies and how we should distribute benefits and costs, and in this case, for climate change. Jonathan is an emeritus professor of public policy in the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington. His activities and research interests recently have been around climate mitigation and adaptation. He has served at various times as the director of the Institute of Policy Studies and the director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University. His recent books and major projects include Foresight, Insight and Oversight, Enhancing Long-Term Governance Through Better Parliamentary Scrutiny, Transforming the Welfare State Towards a New Social Contract, Funding Managed Retreat, Designing a Public Compensation Scheme for Private Property Losses, Policy Issues and Options. Tonight he will speak about retreat from the sea and the policies surrounding that. And if you want a longer version of his talk, please, we will put a link to that on the website, but also if you want, you can just email me and I'll be able to send it on to you. Before we begin, I will pray, and I think all of our thoughts are very much on the other side of the world. So I will pray for the Middle East as well as for ourselves. So let us pray. And this is a prayer that comes from the cathedral here in Auckland, but also from the cathedral St. George's in Jerusalem. We pray for Palestine, for Israel, for all those caught up in this harrowing conflict, for families of loved ones who have died or are being held captive, for children and families who sleep in bomb shelters and safe rooms, for those with nowhere to escape, for those overseas desperate to reach loved ones, for those without electricity, food, water and medical supplies, for hospitals, hospital staff, and locals assisting the injured, for leaders whose decisions determine the lives and livelihoods of many, for those who have witnessed or have been victims to incomprehensible violence, for Israelis, for Palestinians, for all present in the land, for our Muslim sisters and brothers, for our Jewish sisters and brothers, for our Christian sisters and brothers, for creativity and seeking pathways to peace. We pray because we have little else we can do. We pray for peace that begins with each one of us. Pray not for Arab or Jew, for Palestinians or Israeli. Pray rather for ourselves, that we might not divide them in our prayers, but rather keep them both together in our hearts. And we pray also tonight for ourselves and for our longer-term concerns. We pray for Jonathan as he speaks and for us as we listen and ponder what he says. In Jesus' name, amen. So Jonathan, up to you.
Nicola, thank you very much. And I appreciate it's a grim time to be talking almost about any subject, but probably particularly climate change, which is a challenging topic in multiple ways, theologically, ethically, culturally, politically, economically. And obviously our hearts do go out to those who are afflicted right now in Israel, in Gaza. One of the things we need to be mindful of course, is that the cameras of the world are there. The cameras of the world are not in many other places where people suffer. According to UNICEF, over the last 6 years, something like 40 million children, 40 million children have been displaced temporarily or more permanently due to severe weather events and related matters, including the conflicts that sometimes arise from such events. So, of course, much of that is never seen, never heard on the Western media. We'll get on with the topic of this evening, which is climate change adaptation and the inevitability of managed retreat as opposed to hopefully unmanaged retreat. And I want to look briefly at some of the scientific, policy and theological issues in this policy domain. But what I'd like to do is just say a little bit about the global context of climate change and some of the impacts and costs that climate change is having, then move on to say a little bit about the adaptation challenges and the options that we have in the light of the impacts of climate change, talk briefly about managed retreat, a subject that I have been involved in some detail over the last few years here in New Zealand, but I'm also familiar with some of the developments in other jurisdictions, including Australia. And then I want to raise some of the theological and ethical issues that arise out of the discussion. I've got quite a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them very quickly, barely mentioning some of them. Happy to come back and talk more about specific matters during the discussion, but I'm going to do my very best to keep to time and leave plenty of time for discussion. So here's a perspective, at least from one angle, on the challenges of climate change. I hope none of you are taking that sort of approach. So the Earth has, according to scientists, moved from the 10 to 12,000 years of the Holocene to what is now called the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene, the geological era in which human beings are becoming the primary drivers of change on the planet, particularly in terms of biodiversity loss and climate. The Earth is around 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in pre-industrial times, and according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it is very likely that the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that was agreed in Paris as an objective, very likely that this will be crossed within the next 10 to 15 years. Indeed, right now, the planet is already above that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. September this year witnessed temperatures around 1.75 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, compared with, that is, the 1850-1900 average, estimated average. And it looks likely that the next few months, partly driven by the El Nino weather pattern in the tropical Pacific, looks very likely that temperatures will be above the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold for some time, but will then fall back again over the next few years. Greenhouse gas emissions have yet to fall at the global level to any significant extent, and humanity is rapidly exhausting the remaining carbon budgets that are estimated to be compatible with a 50% chance of remaining within 1.5 degrees Celsius or indeed 2 degrees Celsius. And we risk crossing various important tipping points in some of the key tipping elements in the Earth system, most notably the triggering of the irreversible melting of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, which between them have about around 10 meters of sea level rise. Even if we don't cross tipping points that trigger irreversible melting of those ice sheets, we can reasonably expect significant sea level rise over the coming century and beyond, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. Here's a slide which just captures the very small amount of the remaining carbon budget that we have available to humanity for a very, very long time, if we are to have around a 50% chance of avoiding more than 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial on a sustained basis. And we're exhausting that at 10 gigatons per annum, and there's only around 110 gigatons left, so we'll run out of space at current greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide emissions within the next decade or so. And unfortunately, despite huge efforts by many individuals, organizations, companies, and governments around the world, we are not on track to meet the targets that have been set for 2030, let alone 2050. The red lines there on the chart indicate what the NDCs might achieve if they're met. That's the nationally determined contributions that governments have offered to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And you can see just the gap between that and what would be needed to try and avoid 1.5 degrees of warming or 2 degrees of warming. Just to highlight again the extraordinary temperature increase in September that's just passed, which was a whole 0.5 degrees Celsius above any previous September. Some climate scientists, including Dr. James Hansen, a leading American atmospheric physicist, some believe that we will experience more rapid warming over the coming decades as a result of reduced aerosols in the atmosphere due to constraints on the production of sulfur through various regulatory changes in maritime fuels and so forth. And if that is correct, well then, unfortunately, we're going to accelerate the warming pattern and achieve rather higher rates of temperature increase than was otherwise expected. We'll see. I mean, the events of the last few months suggest he may well be correct. This particular diagram just captures some of the tipping elements on the planet. There's roughly 16 main tipping elements, and the estimated temperature increase above pre-industrial levels at which they might tip irreversibly. Now, when I began my involvement with climate change issues around 20 years ago, it was generally expected that we wouldn't cross serious sort of tipping points in the Earth system until around 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But it's now pretty clear on the basis of the best available evidence that actually at around 1.5 to 2 degrees, we will start crossing certain tipping points, and that will have really serious, widespread and irreversible consequences. And it's the irreversibility, amongst other things, that's particularly concerning. What is at risk? Well, a great deal. I don't need to emphasize that. I'm sure you're all well aware of this, whether you're living in New Zealand or Australia or elsewhere. The climate change is having profound implications for temperatures on the planet, for the length of droughts, the severity of heat waves, the severity of storms, and so on. And a great deal is exposed and at stake. And the impacts are becoming more and more apparent all over the world. Here in New Zealand, we've had no fewer than 17 declarations of states of emergency in the last 9 months. 17 separate declarations of states of emergency. That's the most ever, and they've all been due to severe weather events. And I'm conscious that across the Tasman, there have been very significant severe weather events in the last few years. Here's the Brisbane floods back in February last year. There's of course been floods since then. Here's the, actually this is the Sydney floods, not the Brisbane ones, so I'm sorry about that. But that was last year as well. There we go, floods in Sydney in July last year. And of course, there's been flooding in various parts of Australia since then, though I appreciate you're now moving into drought conditions. Now, since I'm going to be focusing mostly on adaptation, sea level rise is going to be one of the most serious challenges for humanity over the coming decades and beyond. And let me just make a few comments about sea level rise. So there's a good deal of uncertainty beyond around 2050 as to the extent and speed of sea level rise. And hence the projections vary depending on a range of variables, including the speed with which humanity manages to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly carbon dioxide emissions, the nature of the Earth system response to increased carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, the extent to which we cross key tipping points, and so forth. In some parts of the world, we're faced with not only sea level rise, but also vertical land movements, both up and down. Here in New Zealand, roughly 40% of our coastlines are subsiding at varying rates, up to about 6 centimeters a decade. So that's going to intensify some of the challenges of sea level rise. We can reasonably expect an additional 15 to 20 centimeters of sea level rise on top of the 20 centimeters we've already had in the last century or so by around 2050. give or take a few years. The projections for 2100 and beyond vary significantly. It seems plausible that we would have a minimum of an additional 50 centimeters by 2100. It's more likely to be higher than that, around 70 to 80 centimeters, but it could be far worse. It could be a meter or even close to 2 meters, particularly if we trigger really rapid melting of the main ice sheets. And I've just got a couple of figures that highlight the extent of sea level rise, depending on the emission reduction pathways that the global community manages to achieve. Perhaps if we look forward to, say, 2300, so that's looking forward almost 300 years, the projections for sea level rise vary enormously, obviously depending on how we reduce, and the extent to which we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the extent to which we engage in carbon capture and storage, and thus begin to pull some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, perhaps with direct air capture or whatever. But there is the potential for even 5 meters, perhaps even 10 meters of sea level rise over the coming centuries. And that is pretty grim. Here in New Zealand, I'm sitting here in Wellington, capital city. Central business district is right next to the harbour, and it's very low lying because it's essentially on reclaimed land. And even 1 meter of sea level rise is going to render the central business district essentially non-viable, at least for periods of time, particularly with storm surges and so forth. So we've got some very serious challenges here, as indeed people do in many cities elsewhere in New Zealand and, of course, in Australia. Around the world, and I won't dwell on this at length, but the major delta areas on the planet are subject to enormous risk. This is the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. The projections for 2050 in terms of areas that are likely to be flooded, inundated, or subject to significant salination is in the left slide, and the more recent projections for 2050 on the right. Now, there's roughly 20 million people living in the Delta area, including Ho Chi Minh City, and plainly, if the projections for 2050 are accurate, then we're going to lose most of the production of rice and other crops from the Mekong Delta, and we're going to require many, many millions of people to move. And this is going to be the case across the world in all the main delta areas, whether it's the Nile or the Ganges, Mississippi, and so forth. So much is at stake. There's a growing literature in this space. If you just note points 3 and 4 on this slide, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its most recent report, this is Working Group 2, released last year, estimates that the value of global assets that will be at risk in 2100 could be between $8 trillion and $14 trillion on the basis of 2011 values. But even more worrying is the potential annual global cost of extreme coastal flood damage from sea level rise and so forth, that could increase from around 0.3% of global GDP currently to around 3% of global GDP at the end of the century. And that would essentially destroy any capacity for further economic growth. In fact, it would render the global community with enormous challenges to function in terms of trade, commerce, food production, distribution, and so forth. The costs of climate change have received quite a lot of attention. I'm not going to go through that, but simply to say, depending on the projections, the costs are going to be either large or extremely large, and they're simply going to grow over the century. One of the things that we're going to have to face is the mass movement of people within countries and across borders. This is a bronze statue in St. Peter's Square, Angels Unaware. It takes its name from the passage in the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 13. It's a sculpture done by a Canadian artist, and it depicts 140 migrants from all manner of parts of the world over many decades. And obviously, we already have in the world today somewhere in the vicinity of 60 to 80 million displaced people, and the numbers rising as we speak. And one of the grim challenges for humanity is going to be how we cope with this mass movement of people. So this is where adaptation policies come to the fore. And my focus tonight is going to be just on one aspect of adaptation, which is the issue of retreating in the face of sea level rise and more severe riverine and pluvial flooding. As the century goes on, the main problem is going to be sea level rise. In the near term, the issues are going to be primarily more severe flooding of river systems and pluvial flooding in urban areas. Here in New Zealand, there's a lot of work being done, as there is in Australia and other jurisdictions, on the sort of policy framework that we will need to cope with what is coming at us from the future. With respect to adaptation, there's a range of possibilities. We can seek to protect properties by building seawalls, stop banks, other defensive structures. We can try and avoid risk by preventing people from building in areas that are likely to be at risk, though determining what areas are going to be at risk is going to be challenging given the all manner of uncertainties that we face. The third option, of course, is to retreat, which is what I'm going to focus on. The fourth option is accommodation. That is where you raise the floor level of buildings, for example, to enhance resilience. Now, managed retreat or planned relocation, as it's variously called, raises multiple issues. I'm just going to focus on a few, namely the issue of how we should fund aspects of managed retreat, and in particular, whether we should provide compensation to those who are going to be losing property, dwellings, commercial or otherwise, as a result of sea level rise. And I was fortunate to be part of a so-called expert working group over the last year, which reported several months ago, middle of August, to our Ministry for the Environment here in New Zealand on a policy framework for managed retreat. And very quickly, our report, which is quite lengthy, outlined the sorts of principles that should guide the development of a policy framework. It talked about the respective roles of central and subnational government. It talked about the kind of planning framework that we would need, including how we might conduct risk assessments that would hopefully be reliable and would minimize the likelihood of judicial challenges. We talked about the sorts of powers that governments will need, including compulsory acquisition of properties. We talked about here in New Zealand the role of our treaty, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and its implications, particularly for how we think about Māori land and other valuable resources that Māori have access to or possess in some sense, and what sort of compensatory arrangements we might need there. We deal at length with the issues of funding, including provision of public compensation for property loss and damage, and we also think about how we should fund that public expenditure and the sorts of institutional arrangements we might need. And I'm not going to spend any time on the goals and principles, save to say there's multiple principles that need to be considered, that among other things, we should be seeking to minimize the long-term costs to society as a whole from climate change, and we should be seeking, obviously, to protect people physically and psychologically. We should be seeking to share the burdens of adjustment fairly, both intra-generationally and intergenerationally, and among the many other things, we should be trying to ensure that we provide safe, healthy, affordable housing to all those who are going to be displaced. The right to healthy, affordable accommodation is a really critical one in all manner of ways. So what we have proposed is a public compensation scheme here in New Zealand, which is going to be the subject to debate through our Environment Select Committee in Parliament over the next probably 6 to 12 months. We outlined a series of arguments for having a public compensation scheme. We considered the objections to it, and then we considered the sorts of ways you might go about designing such a scheme, which would include the questions of scope, eligibility, levels of compensation, forms of compensation, and so forth. And in a nutshell, we argued that we should distinguish between residential and non-residential properties for the purposes of compensation, that we should distinguish between compensation for land and compensation for buildings, and focus particularly on buildings, and in that context, specifically residential buildings. And in that context, we argued that there was a case for distinguishing between principal places of residence, rental properties, and second homes. And we argued that while there seems to be a reasonably good case for providing at least some compensation for the loss of principal places of residence, we certainly shouldn't be providing significant compensation for the loss of second or third homes, many of which will be beach cottages and that kind of thing. We also argued that there should be caps on the total level of compensation, partly for intra-generational equity reasons, but also for intergenerational equity reasons, and so forth. And there's a variety of ways in which we can set caps, and I'm happy to come back to that later. The point here is that we are going to have to move in New Zealand tens of thousands of people over the coming century. It may be hundreds of thousands if we have multi-meter sea level rise. The same will be the case in Australia. In the state of Queensland, for example, there will be potentially hundreds of thousands of people vulnerable to sea level rise in the southeast area, and also obviously in other parts of the country. In terms of how we should sort of fund a public compensation scheme, our report outlines a variety of principles and considers various sources of funding. And in broad terms, we argued for a multi-funding arrangement with funding coming from a range of sources, but probably the majority will have to come from general taxes, particularly in the longer term as the costs go up. So look, that's a very quick run through some of the issues we face in terms of the impacts of climate change, and then how we might respond, particularly in the context of sea level rise, and protecting people who are going to be affected by that particular impact. Now, I just want to raise some of the, if you like, the theological issues that this kind of discussion generates. And I'm thinking here globally, not just locally. And I'm thinking long term, not just in the next few years or the next decade or so. And I'm raising some fairly broad questions that I would really welcome people's responses to. So the first challenge here is that I've got the wrong set of slides, Nicola. I don't know quite how that happened, but there we go. I'll go through these anyway, because I modified these for the purposes of this talk, and for some reason I've obviously put the wrong set up, but there we go. So first question is about the nature of providence. How do we think about God's providential care for the cosmos? In what ways is God acting, and how does God act? And what will God be acting to achieve in the context of the kind of impacts that humanity is inflicting upon creation? Then there are a range of issues around theodicy. How do we think about evil in the context of a God of love, and particularly the concept of natural evil or natural suffering, the suffering that the Earth system kind of imposes on creatures irrespective of human activity, but also, of course, the responsibility of human beings for contributing to greater suffering, both for other creatures, but also for human beings. There's the whole issue of how we might think about humanity's culpability for the kinds of challenges that climate change and other ecological issues are going to pose for people in this generation, but increasingly in future generations as the impacts grow. How do we account for the failure to act responsibly, and what might we do about that? Then there's the question of the complicity of the church and the Christian community globally as well as locally how do we account for the extent of the sort of willful blindness that there is in the church community, the negative attitudes towards climate science, and indeed towards creation care in some quarters? What has been going on kind of theologically in this regard that might have contributed to that approach? Then there's big questions of political theology. How should we think about the role of the state in the context of an increasingly crisis-afflicted world in which there's going to be a need for, in the public interest, for a more extensive use of state powers and coercion in order to move people out of harm's way, ideally preemptively rather than simply post-disaster. Then there are big questions about the nature of justice. What does justice require of us in the context of the climate and other environmental challenges we face? How should we think about intergenerational justice, not within just sort of within nations, but across the global community? And that's really inter and intragenerational justice. How should we think about compensatory justice and its relevance? What about restorative justice and its relevance in this context? What indeed are we going to be able to restore, and how much should we invest in restorative efforts in a context where often things are simply going to get worse and worse? What about compassion, and particularly compassion in the context of mass migration and ever-increasing scarcity of critical resources, including water and so forth? How do we think about living in darker times and so on? So lots and lots of questions here. Final one on hope, which is the subject of the talk I gave last week for the Interchurch Bioethics Committee. Where does our hope lie? Well, as Christians, obviously, in the goodness of God, but what realistically can we expect in the future? What would be a realistic hope? What can be realistically expected from technological improvements or from improvements in the role and functioning of governments or in international organizations and so on? So lots and lots of questions there. How do we explain now the skepticism and denial within significant parts of the global Christian community? Something that I have struggled with here in New Zealand and when I've been in other parts of the world. Why do so many Christians not take the climate crisis more seriously? I appreciate many church leaders, current Pope, leaders of many of the main denominations do, but there's significant swathes of Christians right across the world who have not been taking the climate change crisis seriously. So I've just listed there some of the sorts of reasons that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that help explain the resistance of Christians to exercising kind of creation care. There's the theological grounds that have provided the basis for rejecting evolutionary science, which has then had implications for the willingness to accept climate science. There's a particular kind of anthropology in which humanity is seen to be distinct and above nature and not bound by nature. There's, in some cases, an emphasis on the covenant with Noah in Genesis 9 and the idea that God won't allow another flood. Some people in the Pacific Islands, for example, are very strongly wedded to the view that they're not going to lose their land because of sea level rise, because God won't allow such a thing to happen. Presumably, the view is that there will be some kind of miraculous intervention. Maybe God will suck carbon dioxide out of the global atmosphere and thus prevent the kind of sea level rise which is otherwise going to occur. Doctrines of salvation and eschatology obviously have a bearing on attitudes towards climate science and the ecological crises we face. If people think that nature is sort of out of scope, or that in fact the kind of circumstances we're witnessing are signs of the end times, so that in fact rather than trying to mitigate climate change and adapt. We should sort of just be saying, bring it on, because this will increase the speed with which Christ will return, and so on. Then you've got various political theologies which have tended to exert an influence which is antithetical to taking action to address climate change. Political theologies which are essentially anti-state, anti-regulation, anti-United Nations, anti-international organizations of all kinds, and so on. And then, of course, and we're all affected by this, the sort of cultural norms, values, and expectations that particularly Westerners have, the impact of materialism, consumerism, affluence, prosperity doctrines, and so on. So I'd really be interested in what people think about this, but it seems to me a whole raft of kind of theological, political, cultural, scientific influences have affected the extent to which the global Christian community has been willing to act collectively to help address the challenges that we face. I've got a slide here about compassion in a world in which we face ever-increasing use of emergency powers, the likelihood of people putting up more and more border fences and walls, barbed wire, and preventing suffering refugees from entering their territory, where we're likely to see ever-increasing reliance on self-sufficiency, less willingness to cooperate internationally, more unilateral measures of various kinds, including measures potentially to cool the planet by pumping vast amounts of sulfur into the stratosphere and so on. So lots of really challenging issues there that the church community needs to address, and needs to address with rigor and vigor and prayer, and needs to do, in my view, collectively. Now, Nicola, I'm just about out of time, so let me just make a few summary comments. I appreciate what I've talked about now covers a very wide sort of terrain, and in most cases I've just raised questions rather than providing many answers, so sorry about that, but happy to engage in some dialogue. The key points are that humanity is bringing about very significant changes to our climate system. Attempts to decarbonize the planet have yet to really take significant effect, so that very significant climate impacts are now locked in because there's a very significant amount of path dependence in the climate system. We're bound to have significant sea level rise, almost certainly multi-meter sea level rise over the coming century and beyond. We're going to have to adapt. We've got no choice. One of the adaptive responses will have to be managed retreat. In other words, we'll have to move people out of the way. If it isn't managed retreat, it will be unmanaged retreat. And my fear is that a good deal of retreat may well end up being unmanaged, and that this will then impose ever larger costs on society, economically, culturally, socially, and so forth. And a critical issue as we face ever-increasing sort of planetary storms is how do we bring to bear robust theological perspectives, insights, doctrines, and so on to illuminate the path forward for humanity and for us as individuals, for our church communities, and so forth. So I hope there's enough there for people to offer some comments, raise some questions, and so on, and I look forward to your engagement. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have some questions already. Colin, would you like to give your question?
It was just addressing, I think you actually started to point to it just at the end after I posted my question of the issues of justice, considering a significantly greater impact that rising sea level will have on developing nations rather than developed nations. And like I guess your picture of Ho Chi Minh City, you know, where the people there would, you know, have the home that they've worked for and they've got to move, compared to someone in Australia who's got to do something about their holiday house.
Yes, so I think the first thing to say is that all the evidence indicates that climate change is going to impact more severely on poorer countries. and on poorer individuals within wealthier countries. So in other words, climate change is going to exacerbate inequalities both between countries and within countries, unless we take very serious measures to minimize that outcome. And I rather fear we won't, because the advantaged people of the planet will be reluctant to provide the kind of assistance they should be providing to the disadvantaged people on the planet. We should bear in mind, however, that also climate change is going to have some very, how can I put it, abrupt and unexpected impacts as well. So surely, I mean, without doubt, coastal communities, particularly in the latter part of the century and the next century, are going to face disproportionate impacts relative to areas that are well above sea level, inland, and so on. But as we've experienced over the last few decades across the planet, climate change can have very brutal impacts sort of almost anywhere, whether it's in more intense fires or more severe hailstorms, more intense downpours, more severe wind events, and so on. And potentially no one is safe in that context. And here in New Zealand, we've experienced an absolute battering over the last year or so, and we've had a situation where many people have experienced damage to their properties who would not have anticipated having that kind of damage, because they're not in a floodplain and they're not right on the coast, but they've been subject to perhaps significant landslides that weren't expected. And what we do about it, Colin, I'm sorry, how we might approach the challenge of minimizing future inequality, I think is actually a critical issue. And as I mentioned in the report that I've been party to, we have argued very strongly that in the particular response of moving people out of harm's way, we should be providing some compensatory assistance, but it should be capped so that we aren't providing compensation of millions and millions of dollars to multimillionaires who happen to be losing a very valuable coastal property.
Thank you. Brendan, can you please give your question?
Yes, I've just posted a comment there. The challenges to Christian theology itself, I would just say conventional Christian. I mean, I'm theologically trained in Melbourne here through the theological colleges, which take pretty standard theology. Look, I'd just like to say about my own personal situation. I come from a small town called Tumby Bay on the west coast of South Australia and Eyre Peninsula. It's a lovely little town. My family are still living there. Cousins are still living there. In 2001, I went back there and the sand was blowing across the road with a westerly wind, and they had a severe drought, 2001. And I began to question whether this town actually could survive, because we've had a really good climate for the last number of years, with some ups and downs, of course. But this year, there's been no rain at all since August. All of it, so all the crops have failed. And with the El Nino chart, looking for the next 3 years, it looks as though this town will get wiped out. The long-term viability of the town will be questioned, and so whether the whole town will have to be closed. It's a significant town, really, in a good number of people. So it's this adaptation is huge. It's a shock. It's personal and it's direct. That's without waiting. That's without waiting for sea level rises.
Sure.
Yeah, but this.
Sorry, is this Brendan?
Yes.
Brendan.
Yes, Brendan. So look, you have my sympathy. More severe droughts are a feature of climate change, and of course, climate change will have the impact of increased temperatures, which increases evaporation, but also reduced rainfall in many areas, increased rainfall in other areas. And what you're experiencing in your part of Australia is just a microcosm, of course, of what is happening in many, many parts of the world. The Amazon rainforest, for example, is experiencing unprecedented drought at the moment. The rivers are drying up. 250,000 people are sort of now unable to travel because the rivers have dried up and they're running short of water and so on. And of course, this is happening in various all over the world.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So the question comes down to this faithful congregations in the town and how they have to readjust their theology, because they're basically Stoics who think that they're here on earth to endure and be faithful until such time as they go to some other place. And then this raises the question of the incarnation. Why would God bother to become human and bother to dwell within us if it was only a matter of escaping somewhere else? So it really does shake up our whole conventional theology, and so raises the question of what does a liberation theology mean, where we're involved in engaging with God in creating life here on earth sustainably. Yeah, thanks.
Well, look, lots of issues there, Brendan. We could spend quite a lot of time on each one of them. Perhaps I've just, given you've had a reasonable shot, and there's quite a few other questions, I should just perhaps move through a few of the other questions first. Perhaps that's all right.
Do you want to choose which one question you do next?
Well, I see there's a question from Charles, which is a fair question. Why have I not listed scientific reasons for rejecting what is called here climate alarmism? And the reason for that is that I accept the mainstream science, which has been tested rigorously by thousands, if not tens of thousands of scientists over many, many decades now. And there simply don't seem to be any strong scientific grounds for rejecting the proposition that humanity is warming the planet through the burning of fossil fuels and the cutting down of forests, and that warming will continue until we reduce our fossil fuel use and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I just sorry to say, I just don't think the evidence for, if you like, quote, the other side has much of a leg to stand on.
Can you see the graph as my background? Where I've shown, now if you look at that little green line down the bottom there, that's the human contribution to carbon dioxide. The line up near the top there is the natural one, and the red line is the temperature variations. If you were to take the human contribution of carbon dioxide out, the natural one would still be increasing. The temperature would still be rising, which implies global warming is not a human thing. And if so, is it right to ask humans for other humans for compensation for a natural process if that's what it turns out to be, according to this graph?
Well, all I'd say, Charles, is that people are entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And there is absolutely no evidence, there is absolutely clear evidence that humanity is the main driver of the warming that the planet has experienced over the last 50 to 100 years. And that is the view of the overwhelming majority of people who know about this. And as a layperson, I'm a social scientist, I'm not an atmospheric physicist. As a layperson, I just have to go with the overwhelming majority sort of scientific view, and I'm sorry. I mean, the other thing which I think is really critical in this context is to recognize the magnitude of the risks that we face. And if you were to take your view, for example, that you're right, and then we don't take action to address the human impact or the claimed human impact, and you're wrong, then we're going to do enormous damage. I mean, in my view, we're already doing enormous damage. We're going to do even more damage. Whereas if the mainstream science is wrong and we take action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, well, we find out in 50 to 100 years' time, the mainstream science was wrong. Well, I would simply say, praise God, because we've done things which actually are going to enhance human welfare, reduce various types of pollution, improve the way we use our land and resources, protect biodiversity, and so on, all of which will be good. There'll be co-benefits, even if the mainstream science on climate science was wrong, which I'm sure it isn't. So I take partly a risk management view here, as well as simply a view that I think as Christians, we have a responsibility to take, if you like, the mainstream science very seriously.
The trouble is, science is not a democracy. It doesn't depend on the majority. It depends on what is actually happening.
It depends, Charles, it depends on the facts. I'm an engineer, right, and I'm not a social scientist. As such, I'm a natural scientist, and I'm sticking with the facts, God's facts of the universe, not ones that I just want to make up and have an opinion about, or say that I'm a social scientist, so therefore I can do anything else. You can draw any squiggles you like on a graph, and that looks very impressive, but what you've got to do is stick with the scientific facts.
Okay, let's stick with
all
the
right.
science. And let's move on. Sorry, Charles. We're going to move on to Brian Edgar's question, please.
What do you think of the claim, my suggestion of the 6 potential explanations for Christian climate change skepticism, that number 6, your number 6, is the really influential one? That is, it's about self-interest, really, maintaining the standard of living, the materialism, the consumerism that we have, and that all the rest really are simply rationalizations of that, for that position.
Well, Brian, look, you may be right. I'm not sure. There is no question that enjoyment of, if you like, a high lifestyle with international travel, with fossil fuel modes of transport, with vast amounts of throwaway items that we don't need. I mean, the fact that people love that kind of lifestyle and feel, in many cases, they have a sort of God-given right to enjoy such a lifestyle. There's no question that that influences people, and it's the fact that we will need to change how we live that is part of the resistance to efforts by governments and people like me to address climate change. Having said that, I don't think the 5, if you like, theological reasons are all simply rationalizations. There's no question that many people within the Christian community around the world hold to some of those positions and hold very dearly to some of those positions. And that's evident when you read the declarations that various theologians and others have signed up to over the last X decades, which provide, you know, theological grounds for rejecting climate science, which includes the view that, you know, human beings just doing the ordinary things like keeping themselves warm and taking themselves to work, the view that there's no way God could have constructed a world that would mean that doing those sorts of things might cause enormous long-term harm. But of course, they're wrong. And a theology that takes the view that simply doing ordinary things can't cause harm is, I'm afraid, well, fundamentally flawed. And yet extremely gifted theologians, biblical scholars and others have signed up to declarations which say that kind of thing. So no doubt there are multiple factors at work, but I suspect you're right that for many people, the primary consideration is simply they enjoy their lifestyle and they don't want to change.
Good, yeah.
And now, thank you. Richard Milne has a very similar question, but is it really just fundamentalism, and how do we cope with it if it is?
And my short answer is no, I don't think it is just biblical fundamentalism. I think there's a range of other considerations, but clearly a very fundamentalist approach, which might take a very literalist view of the first few chapters of Genesis, and a particular interpretation from a literalist perspective of those first few chapters, is probably going to be more inclined to be suspicious of the mainstream climate science for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. My point is that it's actually very hard to convince anybody who comes from that particular biblical fundamentalism about anything at all.
Yes.
But if there's a broader source for it, then in fact it can be addressed in a logical, rational way, appealing to science.
Yes, but I think, to be honest, Richard, the challenges that you and I have had talking to people about climate science who hold very strongly, if you like, literalist views of the first few chapters of Genesis and so forth, those challenges are replicated in the challenges certainly I've had dealing with neoliberal fundamentalists who take the view that the state can never do anything that's desirable or beneficial, and therefore we have to kind of reject climate science, because if we accept it, we will have to get the state doing things, and people don't want the state to do things. So yeah, it isn't just quote fundamentalism of a religious or faith-based nature. It's really right across the board.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, for a wonderful talk and the inspiration. I'm wondering though, where do we go from here? I'm very familiar with the sort of constraints that you've mentioned in various churches, but other than going through the trauma of climate change or house burdened down or being flooded or whatever, what pressure points are there that may work? I mean, there's lots of diverse theological reasons for sitting on our backsides and doing nothing. And you know, you've mentioned some very good points here. But where do we start? Where do we start with churches that we're very familiar with, where wonderful people, but this just isn't on their agendas? We've got to say, look, the rest of the community around you is vitally concerned about this. How are you going to be a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem and just sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing? I mean, we're getting surveys done in Australia showing that young people want their churches to be more involved in it. Churches are ignoring the whole issue and becoming more and more less and less relevant. So where can we start? What are some points?
Well, I wish there was a simple answer to that question, Warwick. It's a very good question. I've wrestled with that here in Wellington. I've run a number of events dealing with ecological matters from a sort of Christian perspective, either by myself or with others. And it's been a constant challenge to engage some of the, if you like, more conservative church communities, more Pentecostal, charismatic fellowships, and so on. Indeed, I've had people say, oh, when I've asked them to advertise an event among their congregations, oh, look, this creation care stuff, this isn't part of the gospel. Why should we be worried about that? We're in the business of saving souls, not saving animals or preventing sea level rise or something. So look, as we've indicated in the discussion we've had already, there are a variety of theological reasons why people are going to be resistant. There's going to be a variety of psychological and social and cultural reasons that have nothing to do with theology, but and it seems to me one has to probably address each of the potential, if you like, barriers one by one, and obviously the contexts are going to differ. Different church communities are going to have different issues. But beyond, if you like, speaking into the church context, obviously we have a responsibility as citizens to be speaking into the wider public square. And in that regard, obviously there's a whole variety of things that we should be seeking our governments, be it central government, state government, local governments, whatever, to be doing. A, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, in other words, to mitigate the problem, and B, to take measures to anticipate what's coming at us from the future and to prepare, whether that means, in the case of more severe droughts, constructing more irrigation facilities and dams to enhance water storage so that we have a greater likelihood of being able to meet our water needs during droughts, or in the case of sea level rise, thinking about the kind of policy frameworks we're going to need to put in place to move people out of harm's way and to stop people building in areas that are clearly going to be vulnerable to inundation, some decades from now. So there's a whole variety of things that we can be urging governments to do, and then quickly at the personal level, of course, there's all manner of actions that we can take, including how we use our investments, what we purchase or choose not to purchase, what we eat and choose not to eat, etc., etc. So, but I suppose the key point here is that we have a global system challenge. It's not just a personal, piety issue. We have to change our global systems, our energy systems, transport systems, etc. And that requires systemic change that only ultimately big business and governments can bring about. Most of us as individuals can only influence these things on the margin.
Can we expect conservative Christians to be able to think like that? Or really, I mean, I had the same conversation. They said, no, that's the liberal churches. That when we start to think about these systemic changes, it's too much for conservative Christians to get to view that.
Well, then I think then I think we have to have a very serious conversation about what does it mean to love our neighbor.
And our primary responsibility in creation.
Does not loving our neighbor involve a concern about that person's welfare here and indeed in the future, assuming they're going to remain alive, and doesn't genuine love for another person and indeed multiple persons mean that we need to be taking measures to ensure that we aren't harming them or causing them grief or whatever, and doing things that are going to bless them, that are going to enhance their well-being and their life course, their flourishing in the future. So I think, the commandment to love our neighbors, as well as the commandment to love God and to love those things which God has made, the whole cosmos, I think those are pretty fundamental. And if people aren't willing to take those commandments seriously, then I'm not sure what more you can do.
That's right. Okay. Thanks very much.
Jonathan, thanks for
good to see you, Graham.
Discussion. It's very good to see you. You and I can discuss these matters further, but as you know, I couldn't be more concerned about the things you've just been talking about and the resistance, not least in the Christian community, which is deplorable. And it seems to me Orthodox Christianity has always properly been deeply radical, and radical in two ways. Radical in its preparedness to look at things realistically and with prophetic power, and perhaps more realistically and prophetically than any other voice. But also, and I preface this also by saying, I'm worried more and more, not just by we oldies who are resistant, I'm worried by the younger generations who are terrified. They don't need to be convinced of this stuff. They're already educated, and they are living in a kind of terror, which I think is psychologically going to be extremely damaging for them. And the also I now want to say is we should be people of distinctive hope. I've been thinking we've been talking of the classic passage, Jeremiah sitting surrounded by the destruction of Jerusalem with so much to be just utterly despairing about. And he says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord is new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And we've got to be people who can express that hope, as well as that deeply realistic, prophetic analysis of what's going on for the sake of everybody. And it may very much depend on us. Now, I'm stating the obvious, but it seems to me that needs to be our dual voice.
Yes, so completely agree, Graham. I think we have to be utterly realistic. We have to take the nature of the world as it is very seriously. We need to base our decisions to the greatest extent possible on the best available evidence that we have at any given point in time. and obviously the ethical norms that the Christian faith gives rise to. Absolutely. And we also need to be speaking hope, but we need to be speaking hope that is realistic.
That's right.
Rather than, some sort of false or, fantastic kind of hope. And I suppose a quick response in terms of young people, I agree with you. There's a great deal of hopelessness and helplessness and powerlessness and despair. I encounter this among many students that I teach, Graham, as I'm sure you have, and others will across the tertiary systems and indeed at the school system. I suppose what I'd say is, first of all, we need to emphasize the agency which they have and which has been demonstrated, for example, by that little woman, Greta Thunberg, just extraordinary that, a 15, 16-year-old can mobilize hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people through speaking truth to power. So we need to affirm their agency, affirm their responsibility to act, which I think is absolutely right from a Christian point of view. We are all responsible, irrespective of our faith commitments and so on. But also a critical point to encourage people to act in community, so that they're not alone, that they're not isolated. They can draw some strengths, particularly if they're not religiously inclined or Christians, whatever. They can draw some strength from each other in their endeavor. So I do think collective communal kind of endeavor is important. And one of the things I've been very pleased to see is the number of young groups that we have on campus here in Wellington, such as the Climate Change Clinic, which is run by a group of lawyers that are seeking to use the tools of their discipline, law, to, if you like, prosecute in the broad sense the effort to address climate change. So those are some quick responses, but we certainly shouldn't be underestimating the kind of psychological and emotional stress that climate change and the wider ecological crisis is already causing, and the extent to which that is going to intensify over the coming decades, Graham. I mean, I'm profoundly concerned about that.
Yeah.
And you and I will be dead.
Yes, indeed.
Long before the worst happens, Graham.
Yeah, I know. And as I've mentioned to you before, I think that's part of why we've been so disgracefully irresponsible, because those of us who could have done something have recognized or known that this is not really a problem that's going to affect us.
Thank you so much for all you've done for this magnificent presentation, even though it's rather sobering. I'm going to ask John Howell to first of all ask a short question, and then he's going to pray for us as we close officially for the night. But we'll stay online for a few more of these amazing questions. Thank you.
First of all, Jonathan, thank you so much. Very stimulating. I've just got a suggestion to make on how to process the theological questions, and invite you to make a short answer, and then I'll say a benediction. But it occurred to me as you were listening out the theological questions that perhaps one way of pulling those together is to think about commandments for our well-being. That was the view of the Deuteronomists, to say commandments are given for our well-being. And that if we started to formulate some commandments that take into account, if I might quote my mantra, that the earth is shaping us to live with less. If we focused on that, and then secondly, when Moses had the commandments, he also had to face idolatry. And perhaps we need to name the idols, particularly the economic idols, that we are worshipping as false gods. Would you like to make a comment on that?
Well, I first of all, John, thank you. I certainly agree that there are many false idols. Secondly, I think commandments are useful, and the 10 Commandments obviously fall into that category, and are morally, significant. I would just make the observation that one of the challenges we face in many areas of life is applying commandments to complex situations where there may be competing ethical imperatives and uncertainty and risk, and where we have to make judgments in the light of the circumstances we're in, and where you can't just take a rule or a quote commandment out of a book and say, right, this is what we do here. It's not as simple as that. My suspicion is that actually things are going to become ever more complicated as time goes on over the coming decades and beyond, because of the severity of the circumstances we're going to face and the unprecedented nature of some of those circumstances.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about that. So thank you for your contribution tonight. As always, it's been great. I have a benediction from the Iona community. The peace of the earth be with you, the peace of the heavens too, the peace of the rivers be with you, the peace of the oceans too, deep peace falling over you, God's peace growing in you. Thank you, everybody.